We have been in our message series now for the past several weeks because we were looking forward to the anticipation of the Olympics coming. And I don't know if you've had much of an opportunity to watch the Olympics, but it's been kind of fun watching the Olympics to see these people pour their whole lives into everything that they're doing for one moment, if you will. And for some of them, it literally is a minute or it's 2 minutes. These athletes who go into training, they do it so that when they go into the world stage, their goal is not to just make it to the Olympics. Their goal really isn't even to get a bronze or a silver. Their goal is to get a gold. The whole objection of everything that they do is to get a gold medal, even to the point where it means changing their whole lives. Everything that they do with that goal. They talked about the little girl Gabby on the Fab Five, on the gymnast, the girl gymnast, and they said that where she was living in New York, there were no gyms that were good enough, and so they had moved the whole family to Idaho, and they had to get the father and mother got new jobs, and their whole lives changed, so that this little girl could spend up to 6 and 8 hours a day in a gym, so that when she make it to the Olympics. But again, not just making it to the Olympics is enough. It's getting the gold. And if you saw this past week, she was one of many, including our own Baltimore Michael Phelps, reaching the gold. Well, that's kind of what the series has been based upon. It's been living a life that is more than just existing, more than just by the time it's said and done, saying we didn't do bad, but that we actually do reach for the gold. And the gold, according to Jesus, is that we ultimately make it to heaven, we walk the golden streets of heaven. So, if you'll recall, as we started up into this series, we talked about the fact that Jesus had pulled the disciples into the upper room. In just a few moments, he would be going to the cross and he would be dying. He'd spent 3.5 years with these men. He told them everything that they needed to know. He talked to them. He preached to them. He told them when to sleep. He told them when to get up. They laughed together. They cried together. They did everything together. And now he is telling them that he's leading them. In that upper room, right before he goes to the cross, he reminds them of some important things. He says, never fear, because I'm always going to be with you. You don't ever have to be alone or experience loneliness, because I'm still going to be there. There'll be times where you'll be tempted to let go, but hold on tighter during those times. Every day of your life, you're going to have to make a choice of whether you're going to follow me or let go. Always hold on. You're always going to have to choose between doing your own thing or obeying God. Always opt to obey God. He says that he'll give us the power when we need it, when things get tough. Now this week he tells them something that is kind of out from a left side that you don't really see it coming. He said this week to the disciples that are in that upper room, and the same message to the disciples in this upper room, don't worry or be surprised, because the world is probably not going to like you. You pick up in John 15 chapter, he says, when the world hates you, remember it hated me before it hated you. The world would love you if you belong to it, but you don't. I choose to have you come out of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, and so it hates you. Since they persecuted me, naturally they're going to persecute you. And if they had listened to me, they would listen to you. The people of the world will hate you because you belong to me. For they don't know God who sent me. Those poor, innocent little disciples. They had given 3.5 years of their life to Jesus. He now is leaving them. He says, don't worry, I'm always going to take care of you. Oh, and by the way, people are going to hate you. And boy, did the world hate the disciples. As a matter of fact, nearly every one of them that was in that room, we see that just a few short years later, according to secular history, each one of them died because of their faith. Peter, the apostle, was crucified, and when he was crucified, they crucified him on the cross upside down. Andrew died on a cross in Patria, a Grecian colony. James, who writes the book of James in the Bible, is the youngest brother of Jesus, was thrown from a pinnacle temple, and then he was beaten with clubs until he was dead. Bartholomew was burned alive at a stake. James, the oldest son of Zebedee, was beheaded in Jerusalem. Thomas the Doubter was run through his body with a lance in the East Indies. Philip was hanged. Thaddeus was shot to death with arrows, and Simon died on a cross in Persia, which is now Iran. Those 4 disciples. Little did they know what was ahead of them. And Jesus told them, he said, you know what? The world doesn't like me. It doesn't comprehend me. And when you go forward with my message, they're going to be resistant of you. Little did they know that they would be facing some mighty foes, that many of them, almost all of them, would die because of their faith. When I was taking church history in Bible college, one of the most pressing classes was ancient church history, was on how they treated the Christians in the early day. That the persecution was so fierce on them that they would, like we see the Olympic stands being full of people, being packed out with people, they would fill up the stands back in these days with Christians. And they would put them down in the middle of the arena, and then they would loose the wild tigers and the lions upon them, and so that they would pounce and devour and maul these early Christians because of their faith. How barbaric, how crazy, that because of somebody's faith and the way that they look at God, that they would have to die in such a gruesome way, and that the people would get such perverse pleasure, that they would pack out a stadium like we would at an Olympic event, and we would watch these hungry lions that had been fed for days and weeks at times, just sit in, and they would counsel these early Christians. They would talk about the early Christians, how that they would try to defend themselves. They said that they would, the Christian families would put the little kids in the center, and then they would put the women around them, and they would all kind of gather the women like that, and then the men, they would lock their arms, and they would try to encircle and try to protect the women and the children. While the fans are screaming for their death, the lions would fall, and they would begin at the men, then they would work their way to the women, and then hopefully they had gotten all that they wanted, and some of the children's lives would be spared. All because they believed in Jesus Christ, because they were Christians. When I heard that in church history, you can almost hear the words of Jesus that says that when the world hates you, remember, it hated me before it hated you. The words of Jesus resounds millenniums later. When you look at what's going on in the world around us, you will be absolutely aghast. Bishops from Sudan told how their believers have suffered, this is today, torture and enslavement. Food and medicines are used to coerce Christians to renounce their faith. They can have food, they can have water, and they can have medicine if they will just deny their faith in Jesus. Fears of genocide and systematic persecution have forced thousands of people into refugee camps. In Pakistan, Anglicans have been beaten, their churches and villages have been raided, while their women and their wives and children have been raped and kidnapped, all because they profess a faith in Jesus Christ. I had a friend who was from one of those countries where they were being persecuted so severely from Pakistan, and I asked him about it. He said, Rex, you cannot imagine how wonderful it is for Americans to be able to go to church on their own free will and to not be harassed, not to be tortured, not to be killed for their faith. He said, if anybody in my country, word gets out that they're going to be baptized, not only does that word endanger their life, it endangers the whole life of the community, because all of those who are participating in this act is considered criminal, and it is punishable by death. What we regularly celebrate as a great rejoicing is for them an act that could be executed. See, there are shades of the Rhodes Amphitheater and the lions that are still all around us. Jesus, when he was in that upper room, he says, oh, and by the way, the world is not going to like you. They're going to hate you. They hated me first. The world would love you, he says, if you belong to it, but you don't belong to it. The stories go on. Confiscation of church buildings and personal homes, imprisonment, constant harassment has become the norm. Frequently, Christians are followed everywhere in these countries. Phone lines are routinely tapped. It is a criminal offense to even gather and to worship Jesus Christ. Jesus said, I chose you to come out of the world, and so now the world hates you. There was a mission letter that came out not too long ago that was sent to all of the churches for us to be in prayer for a particular church in Turkey. Here's what the newsletter said. Just recently got it. The Church of God is experiencing a police crackdown, and the police have been using any pretense to oppress the members. Recently, they raided 2 churches that were in in service, and they arrested the whole congregation, taking them off to jail, leaving the children alone at the church. Fortunately, there were some latecomers who came, and they were able to take care of the children. Can you hear the words of Jesus? Since they persecuted me, naturally they're going to persecute you. A Presbyterian pastor overlooks threats, and he builds the first Christian church in the region of Pakistan. A mob destroys the church. Masked men invade the pastor's home, and they stab him to death because of his stance, because of his faith. A man leaves Islam to become a Christian. Egyptian secret police arrest him without a formal charge. They torture him with an electronic probe to make him to inform them about other converts that would be in the neighborhood. A Roman Catholic boy in southern Sudan plays in the trees with his friends. Soldiers waging a holy war capture him, and they send him into slavery, where he is given an Islamic name, and he is beaten with sticks by his master's wives. Can you hear the voice of Jesus in that upper room? The people of the world will hate you because you belong to me. He gave us ample warning. He told us that it would happen. And the fact of the matter is, we have to live in the world. And so, as a reminder to us, he tells us it's going to happen. But there's some things I need to remember when the world responds to me and my faith with hatred. The very first thing that you need to remember is this, is that the world hated Jesus first. It hated him first. It kind of comes as no surprise to some first-time Bible students that you would think that if anybody would have been embraced and loved throughout history, it would have been Jesus Christ. What was the message of Jesus Christ? It was love. You can narrow down to one word, love. And you remember in the Bible where he said, if you were to narrow down everything from the Old Testament to New, what is the most important thing that you can do? The most important thing that you can do is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, he said, is equally like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, why in the world would a person like that, whose message was love and uniting people, become so hated? I mean, I know people who aren't Christians at all, and, you know, they don't have a problem with the message of love, that God is love. They probably even embroidered and put it upon their pillow and display it on a couch. Before a fellow whose greatest teaching was love one another, he sure did tick a lot of people off and continues to do so. It was interesting that when I lived in Miami, we had so many homeless people down there. And naturally so, because, I mean, if you're going to be homeless, what a better place to be homeless than Miami, where it doesn't get really cold, right? Well, I was asking some of my friends who've been in Miami all of their life, I said to them, it just seems like we have an abnormal amount of homeless people. You go for a walk and you're just bombarded with people who are homeless and needing help and things like that. And one of them told me, who had been there many, many years, he said several years ago, he said there was a politician in Chicago, and he wanted to take care of the homeless problem in Chicago. So he got this idea, privately funded, buying tickets for all the homeless people that wanted to go a free one-way trip to Miami. And they would buy a bus ticket, they would pay their food, and they, so in the middle of January, February in Chicago, imagine this, somebody come up and said, you want to go to Florida, here's a free ticket to get there, and here's free food to get there. Well, they said an abnormal amount of people came through. Well, it was kind of interesting. The people left, they remedied their problem to a degree, and later came out that he got himself into a lot of trouble for doing it. But it was interesting, when he first did it, this man was hailed as a genius. He had taken care of Chicago's homeless problem, and now the people of Chicago could walk down the streets safely and not have to worry about being reached out for panhandling and things like that. Now, comes along a man like that who does what he does and is kind of hailed as a hero. Do you remember the time in the Bible where Jesus he'd come into this little village, and this village had a major black eye. You talk about something, I can only imagine this were Locust Point. You have a quaint little area where everybody likes to live, and it's safe, and we're very proud of our community. But right on the edge, there was a cemetery of this little village. It would have been much like Locust Point, very proud of the little area. It was this little cemetery, and they had a crazy man that lived in the cemetery. Remember the story? He was crazy. He was full of demons, the Bible says, and that he had ripped his clothes off, running around the cemetery naked. He's lashed himself with the chains where they had tried to bind him, but he had broken them. He had lacerations all over him, and nobody wanted to go near that side of town because of this black eye that this community had. Well, Jesus, the very first thing that he does when he gets to the community, he goes to that cemetery. He sees the crazy man running around and frothing at the mouth and throwing his body against the tombstones and things. And the Bible says that he casts out those demons, if you remember, into pigs. The pigs went over the cliff, they killed all the pigs and all. Well, the next scene that we have in the story is the city people are kind of gathered around to see what Jesus had done up there at the cemetery. And there sits that crazy, demonic man, completely sane. He's clothed. He's carrying on a conversation. He's normal again. Now, you would think that the people would say, this Jesus is all right by us. You know, he can come to our town anytime. If you're going to take care of a situation or problem like that, you know what the crowd said? In Mark, the 5th chapter, the 17th verse, and the crowd began pleading with Jesus, would you please go away and leave us alone? A politician in Chicago can give free tickets to people and get rid of them like that, and he's hailed as a hero. Jesus comes in, heals the people, the person. You would have thought that they would be giving the keys to the kingdom. You would have thought they would be giving him a good neighbor award, and they're all saying, would you just get out of our town? The handwriting was on the wall for the disciples, and much thought about the realization to it all, that Jesus spells it out to them. He's kind of like a teacher that's in front of a chalkboard on that last night with them. He goes, okay, you fill in the blank. If the world hates me and persecutes and kills me, then the world is going to what to you? You know, he's trying to get it into their minds. This message of love is not always going to be received with pomp and circumstance. You know, this message of hatred of God and hatred of his followers, it just permeates all the places of the good things that we do. Watching this Aurora assassination with this guy went in and killed the people when the cinema, they said what hit home about that was the fact that this was just so many years after the Columbine, which was about 30 miles away. When I lived in Denver, I lived right in between the two of these. When I lived in Denver, that Columbine situation was still very, very sensitive, even though it was 7, 8 years after it had happened. But do you remember the story of Columbine when it all happened? It kind of brought to my attention, where these high school killers, packed like they are terrorists, go into the school and they open up fire on people that are in the library and things like that. And there was one story that stood out in my mind. He says, girl, her name was Cassie Cornell. She was 17 years old. She was a junior in high school. She'd gone into the library to study. And here comes in this teenage killer, United States, born, bred, and raised, holds a gun to the 17-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl's head, and he asked her a question. Do you remember the question? Do you believe in God? And there she looked at a gun right down at, basically inches from her nose, and she said, yes, I do believe in God. The gunman then asked her why, and before she had time to answer, he shot her to death. You can hear the words of Jesus throughout the time of history. If they hated me, they're probably not going to be excited about you. Let's face it, Jesus is very polarizing. I become a Christian, I have a peace that passes all understanding, but I may not have peace in my own house. One day I had a lady come into my church when I was in California. And she told me, she said, I met a guy, and she said, and I told him when we started dating, I want you to know that my faith is very important to me. And she said, in order for me to date you, you've got to allow me to be able to practice my faith. And she said, and ideally, I would like for you to go to church with me. And he said, oh, no problem. I'll do anything. Yeah, I've been to church. I believe in God. She said, we dated, we got married, he went to church with me periodically and all. She said, then we had kids. And so he finally told me, he said, I'm not going to go to church with you, but if you want to go, if you want to take the kids, he said, have to it, all you want. So she said, every Sunday I get up, I get the kids ready to go to church, and said, but he got angry. He was getting angry every time that I would leave and take the kids. Finally, he told me, he said, you can go to church, but the kids stay home. She said, then it got to the point where he said I couldn't go to church at all, that I needed to stay at home. She was in my office that day. It was Friday afternoon. She said, the reason why I stopped by is I want you to pray for me. And I said, what do you want me to pray about? She said, I'm going home tonight, and I'm telling him, please don't make me choose. Because if I choose, and I have to choose between you and Jesus, she said, I'm going to choose Jesus. You know what Jesus said about the way that people would receive us as believers? In Matthew the 10th chapter, he said, some of you will have enemies that will be right in your own household. Isn't that interesting? Jesus is very polarizing. People don't just either take him or leave him. They either love him or they hate him. They either want to worship him or they want to crucify him. So if you go through difficult stances because of your faith, that's okay. Remember what Jesus went through. A second thing to remember is that when you're feeling that hatred is that the world is not going to understand Christians. We truly do march to the beat of a different drum. Jesus' final prayer when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane was that God would keep us safe, that he would keep the enemy away from us, because he knew that we would be persecuted and we would be attacked. At times it appears that the church is under the critical eye of the world. Whenever people want to be critical, it's many times released upon the church. If the church does something, well, then it wasn't enough. If they give back to the community, well, it was expected they should have given more. If they build buildings to accommodate their people, well, they should have been given it to the poor. The world is very critical of the church. We had a family in our church in California that they were the roughest family that I had ever met in my entire life. I mean, you picture rednecks with motorcycles and tattoos and torn off shirts, and you got the picture, the middle picture, the girl in the back of the motorcycle, and that long hair on both of them. The guy's hair's longer than hers, but he's got a party in the front and a party in the back and business in the front. A mullet there. He's got one of those. You got the picture of this couple, and their kids and all that. Wow, and drugs and prison, homeless, and everything. Well, he said one morning, he said they came to our church. I can still see them walking in, all Christians sitting there looking at their mess and all that. Here comes Harley and his wife and their little entourage of yours, mine, and our kids. And they got there early. They stayed afterwards, and I talked to them, and they told me their life story. They said, we just kind of woke up one day in a haze and said, there's got to be a better way of living. We got to do something differently than this. And we said, we're going to go to church. So they looked close to church, and here we were, and walked in and things like that. Well, the next Sunday they came back, got there early again, stayed late, but this time they had a story. They said, we put our family through everything that you can imagine with our lifestyle and things like that. Said, well, last Sunday, our family panicked. They started calling us early on Sunday morning, which was when we're normally sleeping off our hangovers and our, whatever. And they said, and we were nowhere around. Husband, wife, kids are all gone, and they began to panic. They called the police, they called people, neighbors, friends, everybody worried about where they were. So when they came in late, because they had stayed at church talking and all that, they were beside themselves. And they said, where have you been? And they said, well, we got up and went to church today. They said, after they laughed, they said, no, seriously, where have you been today? And they said, we got up and we went to church today. She said, you would have thought that they would have been so excited that, we're trying to change things like that. She said, we've been through homelessness, we've been through prison, we've been through drugs, we've been through alcohol and all that, and said that they looked at us and said, do you know what you're getting yourself into? They said, getting ourselves, the first time that they were ever concerned about us was when we went to church. The world does not necessarily stand up and applaud people because of their faith. Jesus said, don't be surprised by it. 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter says, dear brothers and sisters, you're foreigners and aliens here. So I warn you to keep away from evil desires, because they fight against your very souls. Finally, the third thing is to understand that the world may reject us because they don't understand us. When somebody doesn't understand something, what do we normally do? We normally attack it. We normally try to run from it. Abby, my 13-year-old daughter, came down and spent the summer with us, and as she was down here, Locust Point, as I said, is one of the coolest places in the world to live. I can't imagine living in a better community. But in the summertime, with all this construction going on, we do have occasional rats that kind of run up and down the sidewalk. And in the backyards where people put their garbage, we have rats that kind of hang out back there. And then I've never seen water bugs like I have seen around this place, these huge water bugs. Well, we'd gone out one evening, and I left Abby at home for just a little bit. It was just getting dark. And she got on the phone, and she said, called me a few minutes after I left. She said, Dad, I went out back, and there are like 5 rats, and they're bigger than our dogs out there. She goes, I'm scared of rats. And I said, Abby, just shut the door. And I said, lock the door. And I said, it'll be all right. Well, then a few minutes later, she called, she said, there's huge bugs are coming in from underneath the thing. So the rats are chasing around the backyard, these huge bugs, and I could just picture her getting on the phone and calling her mother, and her mother thinking, where does he live? That all of this is going on. So we put the towels up there, we got home, and God love her, she was a trooper. She's out there trying to kill those and chase the rats away and things like that. Well, we were laying there watching television, the lights were out, and it's really dark, and all of a sudden, Abby jumped up, and she went after something. She was stomping and throwing shoes and kicking at it, and all that kind of thing, and I just kind of lay there and watched her. And finally, when she got finished, I looked over and I said, what'd you do? I said, what was it? She said, I'm not sure, but I killed it. And I'm kind of thinking that that's the way we are with people that we don't understand or we don't necessarily agree with, or if we don't know, we attack, and sometimes we kill. Sometimes the world doesn't understand us as Christians, and we do march to the beat of a different drummer. We go the extra mile. We turn the other cheek. When somebody wants our coat, we give them our hat as well. When somebody insults us, we forgive them. And it's just a different lifestyle that people don't understand. Jesus said people will not applaud you for choosing the route you do. They will actually, many times, and he uses the word, hate you. True story of a time in Russia when it was under attack and communism was the rule there. Christianity was outlawed. There was a church that was meeting, and they couldn't publicize where they were meeting, like you couldn't tell them at 1030 or 1308 Beeson Street, but they had to do it in codes. They had to send one person to another. You didn't tell somebody else unless you really thought that they were legit and really coming to church. They worshiped in hiding. This still happens over in other countries as well. Said one day they were out in the middle of the woods. They were in this little shed and they were worshiping. They were having a worship service when the door burst open. All of a sudden there were 2 Russian soldiers standing there, full armed guard, guns. Everything, the boots, the helmet, the gloves. And they said, what's going on in here? Nobody said anything. They said, is this a worship service? And still nobody said anything. One of them said, if it's a worship service, you know that it's against the law, and I'm going to allow anybody to leave that wants to leave right now. Several people got up and left. The soldier walked around and looked at him a little bit more. And he said, you can be persecuted. You're not persecuted, you can be executed because of what you're doing here. If this is a worship service, I'm giving you one more chance to walk out the door. There were another couple of people got up and they shot out the door. Finally, afterwards, he looked at the ones that were sitting there and he said, is this a worship service? And one of them said, it is. He said, you know what? He said, I'm interested in this Jesus, and I wanted to make sure that I was with real Christians. And he sat down and he started to join. This morning, it is a privilege to be able to come, to be able to worship God. It's not because we're weird or odd. It's just because the Bible says that our heart, our passion is not in this